Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Mirror of Intimacy webinar. I'm Dr. Alexandra Katehakis, and today is Monday, November 6th, and our topic today is empathy, which is certainly a heavy topic for the world right now, and something we need a lot more of. So a few basics before we get started, though. I want to remind you to type your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll answer them as we go along, and also to leave us your book reviews or comments on Amazon for Mirror of Intimacy. Let us know what you love about the book, how you share the book, how you use the book. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button below so you can never miss a post. And also, sometimes people will ask during these webinars whether they'll get to see this again or if it's recorded or where to find it. And I just want to reiterate that all of the Mirror of Intimacy entries can be found on our YouTube channel. So you just go to youtube.com, you type in Center for Healthy Sex or Mirror of Intimacy, and there you will find today's webinar and all the previous ones for the last several years. You can also keep up with what we're doing by following me on Instagram at Alex Katehakis or at Center for Healthy Sex. So let's get started then. And a reminder to please type your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, because I can't see the chat box. Also, any questions or statements I make about books or upcoming events or anything of that nature, you will find in the chat box also. The quote for today is from Henry J.M. Nguyen, and he writes, "When we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand." So, as usual, I want to reread that. When we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, and that's a tough question to answer when you think about the people in your life, friends, family members, who you love, who shows up for you. And if you had to choose, which person means the most to you, that's very difficult to answer unless you have a criteria for it. And he says that we often find that it's the people who instead of giving us advice or solutions or cures, in other words, they start telling us what to do, which most of us don't actually need. Past a certain age, once we're into adulthood, we already know what we should do and typically what the solutions are, but we just want to be heard, right? So instead, those people choose to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. And I think that's beautiful. The best listeners in our lives are the people that we feel the most comfort and safety with. So who are the listeners, and are you a good listener? And think about those two questions as we go along here today. It's through empathy that we perceive and share an emotional reality with other people. And it's in the actual moment that we're having the conversation that we can feel that emotional reality with the other. And when we bear that kind of witness, it really requires the desire to change the person, change their emotional dynamic, change what their perceptions are, seeing the world. Because wanting only to fix another's pain can come from our desire to not have to feel it ourselves. And I can think of no better example than when we have a friend who's struggling with addiction or illness, and we want to tell them what to do, that you should try this remedy, or you should go to this practitioner, or you should stop drinking, gambling, what have you, and go do this program. That only creates frustration in us and the other person, because the other person's not ready to make those changes or to investigate those options. And so instead, we end up sounding judgmental and bossy and controlling, even though it's coming from love and a desire to help the other. Because for us, we know what the solution is. We know what the answer was for us. And it may be for that person too, but they have to come to it on their own. So being willing to just bear witness, that means we have to drop any outcome about where that person's headed. And it's tough when we watch people in active addiction or watch people who are actively sick and won't do anything about it, or are they're caving into the sickness. Somebody whose doctor says, you really need to get up and walk and get your heart in shape and just take a short walk every day and build up to walking. And they won't do it. All they do is sit in front of the TV in a chair, and they keep getting sicker and sicker because their body is starting to atrophy. And certainly their heart would be too if they were that sick, that far gone. So there's an old saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So even the leading to the water can be problematic with people that are really entrenched in their pain. And it's their journey. We have to remember that it's their journey, that it's their process, and we have to give them the space to have that process. And then we have to tolerate our own pain, the pain that brings up in us, or the times when we were in pain and we didn't do anything about it. And some typical defense mechanisms we might see, or that people use to displace empathy, can be things like minimizing the problem, like it's not that bad, or overblowing the problem, getting sort of overly dramatic about something when it's actually not that bad. And that can push people away also. Or distracting with other things. I've been listening to this podcast about chronic pain. And one woman was talking about how much pain she was in. I think she had fibromyalgia, and she talked about how she had all these teeny little projects going all the time that kept her super busy, that distracted her from how much pain she was actually in. And so she never really stopped to make contact with her body, to listen to what her body was saying and all of that. So think about whether you employ some of these defense mechanisms. Do you minimize what's going on with you, or do you overblow it so that pushes people away? Or do you just distract yourself, just telling yourself that everything is going to be fine, even though you know that you're not fine, that you are in emotional or possibly physical pain because of it? And for people who weren't shown empathy in childhood, they will struggle to practice it as adults. And empathy is a very complicated process in the brain and in the body. It's not that we're being shown empathy when we have an empathic caregiver, one that is really feeling our lived experience with us. So it's not just knowing how we feel intellectually, but really feeling it with us. That starts to activate the empathy centers in our own brains. And so we will have more affective or emotional empathy. And a lot of people have to fake empathy. They have to fake like they care because they don't really feel it, because they weren't treated with empathy, compassion, kindness in childhood. So classic non-responses to childhood distress would be things like stop crying, or you're okay, or here, have a lollipop, or eat a piece of cake, or don't make such a big deal about it, or big boys don't cry, or big girls don't cry. In other words, the parent is not being in what we call a contingent communication with the child and really being with the child. Instead, they start doing things to the child. They start trying to get the child to feel better, to make it go away, instead of honoring what just happened. But this is just stressful. It's distress that causes stress, and it is painful, and it does hurt. And ultimately, you will be okay, because I'm here to make you okay, to help you be okay. That's what a good parent does, is they regulate the child. But just telling them to stop, or shoving food at them, or shaming them, does not build empathy in the child over time. It's actually a shame proposition. A lack of empathy stunts the reparative neurophysiological processes that I'm talking about that build secure attachment, meaning the empathy centers of the brain, the regulation of the autonomic nervous system, the capacity to tolerate upset and know without a parent there that it's just going to be okay. And so we want to build this in ourselves. And without it in childhood, it substitutes this endless psychological loop from emotional stasis to disruption, meaning you're just in that emotional state all the time, or you feel disrupted all the time. And if it's really bad, if the assault is coming at the child over and over again, at some point that child dissociates because they just can't stand it, because nobody's coming to their rescue. Nobody's coming to say, you know what, it's okay. I love you. Let me hold you. Let me hug you. Let's go for a walk. Let's just lay here together and maybe take a little nap. Instead, the child's nervous system can't handle it. And so the child goes into dissociation, and that becomes a trait in adulthood, making it very challenging to feel much of anything. So it's not just painful feelings that get stuck without the healing connection of empathy or a primary caregiver, but success can also have rarely received empathy, approval, but not empathy, like, oh, good job. But nobody's understanding like what it took to do that good job. How many sleepless nights, how many hours in front of a computer, how many times a project went sideways and you had to start it over again. No one's saying, wow, I can't imagine what it took to do that. It's more just sort of good job and moving on. And so that can leave the recipient of that kind of approval feeling empty all the time, like it's never enough. Or maybe if they just did it a little better or gave more or tried harder, then they would get the empathy that they need. So if any of this is resonating for you as I'm talking here, feel free to type a comment or a question into the chat box, and I'll happily address that with you. Then it makes sense that a crucial tool in any relationship is self-empathy, self-compassion. If we block self-empathy, especially during our bleakest moments, our most challenging moments, we're going to be limited to empathize with others. And oftentimes what most of us do is that we beat ourselves up at the worst time, at our bleakest moments, when we're in the most emotional pain, calling ourselves stupid, or I shouldn't have done that, or it's my own fault that I hurt my knee or my wrist or my ankle. I'm an idiot. Oh my gosh. And so that is just perpetrating more violence on the self. So being able to have self-compassion on a daily basis is really important. It's a daily basis, not when you're in trouble, because when you're in trouble and you're under duress, it's actually harder to do. So I want to remind you to please type your comments into the Q&A box and not the chat box, because I can't see the chat box. So somebody writes, how do you deal with unempathic doctors? Do you just ignore them? No, I think if your doctor is unempathic, you should change doctors. I recently did that myself. This doctor was supposed to be, quote, the best. And I just kept feeling over and over again that I was being ignored. And he didn't really know who I was. And I thought, this is not healing. There is no way that if I'm really in trouble, like I need a surgery or something terrible goes wrong, that I'm going to even trust this human being. So I'd rather have a doctor that isn't, put on a pedestal by everybody in town, who's just good enough, that's kind, that has a bedside manner, that is nice, than somebody who I feel is ignoring me. And it depends. If you have a long time situation, let's say you have a chronic, I hope you don't, but if you have a chronic autoimmune deficiency problem and you've been seeing this doctor for years and the hassle of changing doctors is just exhausting to you, then I think you have to talk to the doctor about it. I wouldn't ignore it. If I had a chance to get in front of this doctor that I'm talking about, I would have said to him, this is what's going on and this is why I'm leaving your care. Because our tendency is to, be snippy with the person that books their appointments. And it's not their fault. They're just in this, pressure cooker with the doctor. So no point in complaining to somebody else. It's always best to confront these difficult conversations in person and be transparent. Someone writes, I completely relate to the lack of empathy from our parental unit. I was raised with the belief that if we're strong, in quotation marks, we get on with it. That's how my parents survived, or just offering money or food. Yeah, and that, I'm really sorry to hear that, Marianne. It's very painful. But when we track back to our lineage through our ancestry, we start to see that we are the product of generations of trauma, like multi-generations of traumatized people. And it's amazing that they could even ever have a child. And they sure didn't know how to raise children, not based on what we know today, because you have to remember there was a time when children were to be seen and not heard, and that you spare the rod. If you spare the rod, you spoil the child, meaning if you don't hit your child, you're spoiling them. So all of these antiquated ideas that just perpetrated trauma from one generation to the next. So you have an opportunity here to dive deeply into the pain of not getting what you needed as a child, and to hopefully do that with a good therapist that can take you into those painful places and go back and get that little girl and bring her into the present and parent her and have compassion and empathy for her and talk to her on a regular basis. Because at this juncture, nobody's going to come to our rescue, right? We're adults now, so we really have to come to our own rescue, and we really have to heal our own tender and broken hearts. Arthur says, I remember getting, I'll give you something to cry for, right? I'll give you something to cry about. So that is an act of violence for sure. So you've got a child that's already dysregulated. They're upset because they're hurt or they're scared. And the parent, I think, goes into shame, or they're so avoidant themselves, they don't know what to do. So they end up, attacking their child further by making those kind of statements. Can someone who's been dissociating since childhood learn empathy for self and others at age 50? Yes, but you're going to need a therapist to help you with those dissociative structures, because those are neural pathways in the brain and in the body. And you have to work diligently to not let yourself drift off like that, to constantly bring yourself back to the present moment, back to your feelings, to tolerate your feelings, to talk about your feelings. So it's definitely a lot of work, but you might as well do it now, because you'll be 55 or 60 before you know it. And that's a lot of time, 5 or 10 years. So why not put your nose to the grindstone of your own personal growth and development and start to change these structures, because they are plastic. We have not only neuroplasticity, but we have autonomic plasticity too. So I would encourage you to definitely take this on as your personal path. So Lisa's asking about the difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is a felt state of the other. It's emotional, it's affective. It's when your best friend tells you that their dog died suddenly, and they're sitting in front of you and they're welling up in tears, you well up in tears also, because your heart breaks for your friend and you know what a loss that was for him or her. So you're feeling with the person. You are in their shoes. You're having a lived experience with them. Whereas sympathy is feeling bad for somebody. And that can feel patronizing when somebody needs empathy, like they lost their dog and you're like, oh, I'm sorry. I feel bad for you. You should get another dog, right? There's something cold about that and cognitive. and it's not sensitive at all. Sympathy is more what we feel for people when we know someone has died in their life. Let's say you go to, we'll use the doctor's office, and you check in at the doctor's office and the receptionist is there and you know her, and you ask her how she is, and she said, "Oh, my dog died last week." And you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." That is more cognitive empathy or sympathy for the person. And when we tell people we're sorry for their loss when somebody passes away, we're sympathetic with what happened. We understand because we've all lost somebody or a creature that we love deeply. So they are different. One is more affective, emotional, and one is more cognitive. The name of that podcast is called Curable, just like it sounds, Curable. I think I might be able to write it here. And it's a wealth of information. David says, "I recently discovered through therapy that I was not shown empathy as a child and was actually modeled entitlement and narcissism. I'm desperate to develop empathy, but I'm still numb inside, lacking empathy for myself and others. Any recommendations to develop empathy and unlock the feeling, the ability to feel pain and sadness?" Well, you have to move out of your left brain, out of your thinking brain, and into your heart, David. And that is no easy feat. And it also sounds a little esoteric. Like, how do you do that? My guess is you probably intellectualize everything, and you defend against vulnerability by being smart or clever or knowing everything already. So you really have to be willing to not know, and also be willing to contact the shame of not knowing under the narcissism, which means you've got to make yourself vulnerable. So being in situations where you feel like you don't know what's going on, taking a class that you don't know anything about so that you're not the smartest, and that you don't go to the head of the class, but that you can tolerate being seen vulnerable in front of a group of people, and starting to feel what it feels like. Because my guess is with that kind of narcissistic family structure, you feel shame internally and even humiliation. So tolerating the shame, tolerating the humiliation, talking about your vulnerability starts to allow you to feel more vulnerable also. So that's my best recommendation. The other is to stay in therapy, because it takes a long time to get to those deeper defenses. Someone says, "What is your advice on how to have empathy for someone who hurt you and betrayed you, but maintain your own boundaries that you cannot be in that relationship anymore, and that person is not likely the right one for you?" Well, it sounds like you've answered your question in your question. We can have empathy for people that have been terrible to us, that have hurt us, that have lied to us, that have threatened us. When we start to see that they're struggling, they're in pain, and to wish that person well, to, if this is appropriate for you, to pray for them, to pray for their health and well-being and their peace. But that doesn't mean you have to take their phone calls, or you have to be friends with them, or you have to go out with them, or bake them bread. And that's where the boundary aspect comes in that you're talking about. So any way that you want to communicate in non-local ways, so symbolically, in other words, where when you see that person's name or your friend starts to tell you about them and you notice you get jealous, to just take a deep breath and say, "I'm not going to be jealous about this. I'm going to be happy for that person. I wish them well. I surround them in white light. I'm grateful that they were in my life because I learned something from them." So take yourself out of a victim position and be in a place of gratitude, and also do not collapse your boundaries. How do I practice empathy with an intimate partner without losing a sense of my own feelings when we may be at odds? Enmeshment. Well, it's hard to have empathy when you're enmeshed because you're so busy tracking the other person and what they need and what they want that you're not actually really seeing them. And this is true for the concept of codependency or love addiction. These are problematic ways of relating in the world, and they actually prevent us from being intimate, from really being close, because we are, if we're love addicted, we're constructing that person the way we want them to be, the way we need them to be, but we don't really see them. We don't understand that they're a person that also has struggles and pains and insecurities because we're just painting them with this picture of how we need them to be. And if we're codependent, we're so busy managing the other person and making sure that they're okay, because that's how we learn to survive in our family of origin, that we also don't see them. And a lot of times people get disgusted by codependent people by saying, oh my gosh, they're constantly asking me, are you okay? Or do you need anything? Or do you want more food? Or can I help you with that? And so it can feel infantilizing being on the other end of that, which can be a turnoff to that person and have them pushing the quote codependent person away. So I'm not saying that you are either one of these things, codependent or love addicted. I'm using those as examples of how out of hand um, that can get and how that preempts empathy completely. So you can have deep empathy with a stranger if you really connect with them and ask them how they're doing, but it doesn't mean that you're going to take them home or that you're going to fix their car or that you are going to manage their feelings for them. And Allison writes, I'm empathic, and yet I admonish myself and minimize when I'm in pain, unwell, or following an accident. It's so deep rooted, but there seems to be a contradiction in this. And I would say that's true, that you want to examine, what your empathy for other people is about, and also where it's coming from. Is it really coming from your heart, or is it coming from a place of feeling like you have to people please or do that for people to like you? Allison, I would recommend that you look at the Mindfulness Self-Compassion Workbook by Kristen Neff, and you can find that on Amazon. And also it will be typed into the chat box for you. But I highly recommend that you work with that workbook and get to the bottom of what happens that you treat others better than you treat yourself. And maybe because you're just longing for other people to treat you nicely, that you're looking for some reciprocity. But, there's a saying that we cannot stop the violence in the world until we stop the violence on ourselves. So we have to stop beating ourselves up and treating ourselves poorly and being unkind to ourselves, because if that's how we treat ourselves, that's how we treat other people. And if you are judgmental of other people, it's clear that you are judgmental of yourself also. So watch the way that you judge other people and see if instead you can, say a prayer, surround them in white light, or wish them well in the universe, whatever your cosmology is, and let them be on their way so it's not sticking in you. Okay, good questions, everybody. So empathy lets us see into other people, as we've been talking about, and self-empathy keeps us from being invisible. When we start to have self-empathy, we actually have more confidence. And we feel more entitled to take up our little teeny tiny space in the world, meaning we don't let people walk all over us and we don't let people take advantages of us. Then it can be as simple as checking in with yourself during any conversation or situation, or just by voicing it in your mind, by, let's say you're talking to somebody and they're really challenging, and you just say to yourself, this is really difficult for me right now, or boy, I'm really triggered, or wow, I can't believe how joyful I feel when I'm in this conversation with this person. But be your own best therapist in those moments. Don't just fall asleep or go into a daze. Ask yourself, what am I feeling in this conversation right now? And if it's hard, take the risk of saying to that person, I just have to slow down the conversation, but I need to tell you that this conversation is really difficult for me right now. And maybe the rest of that is, thank you for hanging in there with me, or I appreciate your honesty, or whatever it might be. But if you're triggered talking to a friend or your partner, you might say, I feel really triggered right now. Can I just take 5 minutes out of this conversation, or 10 minutes? And it's not about you. I'm just getting activated because I don't like being told what to do. And I feel like you're telling me what to do right now. And maybe you're not, but that's how it's feeling for me. So I just need to take 5. I need to go outside and get some air, and I'll be right back. So take care of yourself. Be good to yourself. Treat yourself the way you would treat a good friend. So our daily healthy sex acts today start with recognizing that an elementary step towards empathy is reflecting back what you hear when you're talking to another person without inserting our own thoughts or feelings. Just something that simple is a way to practice empathy. When we're in a conversation with somebody and they're trying to tell us something and we keep trying to relate to what they're saying. Oh, yeah, I did that once too. Or, oh, I know what you're talking about. Or, oh, yeah, once when I was in Africa, blah, blah, blah. The conversation gets circled back to me. It just constantly keeps coming back to me. So the person that is talking does not feel heard. So if you can just reflect back what you're hearing instead of inserting your own thoughts and feelings, you'll go a long way with that. It would be like me saying to the person, I forgot who it was, wow, I hear that your doctor doesn't have a good bedside manner. I'm so sorry to hear that, right? Instead of saying, oh, I had a doctor who was a jerk, and let me tell you what I did. Very different stance. And ask a willing participant to relay an emotional event from the day, like a friend or a family member, and then just try to connect with that experience by repeating key phrases. If the person says, I felt uncomfortable, then simply repeat, you felt uncomfortable, in a similar tone of voice. And observe your capacity for bearing witness without trying to fix or change or distract the other person. And try to do this from a place of, from your heart, if you will. So it's not just you're going through this drill and you're repeating it. And you know what, in the beginning, if you don't have empathy, that might be what it feels like and what it looks like, because it goes back to that adage of fake it till you make it. But just the willingness to try this is saying, hey, I don't know how to do this. I'm a little bit impaired here. I really want to get it. Will you help me get it? And I'm going to do the best I can here. And then afterwards, notice what it felt like for you to be able to say, you felt uncomfortable. Wow, I think maybe I know what that feels like a little bit. Or I felt uncomfortable doing this exercise with my friend. Oh, maybe that's what empathy feels like. We all feel uncomfortable sometimes, but just being able to name it is a different story. And ask yourself how you practice empathy during sexual and romantic times. Because truly seeing and being seen by your lover can align with your bodily pleasure and emotional connection. So are you deeply present? And of course, that's a more advanced practice. Right now, we're talking about just being able to hear somebody and repeat what they're saying with your clothes on, and dealing with your discomfort doing that. But a deeper practice is certainly during a romantic interlude where you're with a partner and you're just gazing into their eyes across the table, a dinner table, maybe when you're out at night, or even in the morning when you're sharing coffee and feeling how much you love that person. There is a deep feeling and knowing of the other that you realize that you don't actually really even know, even though you've known them for a long time. So truly seeing and being seen is what we all want. It's what we wanted. It's what we needed in infancy and wanted in childhood and want every day of our lives. And when we feel more seen and felt, then we're much more inclined to trust and to surrender to bodily pleasure also. So experiment sexually by bringing empathy to your love life in whatever form that is, as you continue with this practice of empathy. So I wonder if we have any last questions here. I thought I saw a question and then maybe it went away. Well, I want to support all of you in practicing empathy today. Maybe it's with somebody you don't like, right? That doesn't mean you have to call them or go find them in any ways, but I want you to think about today what you're holding on to in terms of feeling threatened by them or scared by them or not liking them or judgmental of them, and see if you can just release that and say, you know what, they're a human being, they're suffering also. I'm going to let that go, and I'm going to forgive myself for having gotten into relationship with them or having trusted them or whatever happened along the way there. So start with that. Another exercise would be the one I just went through, where you find a willing participant in your life today to ask you to ask them to tell you something that didn't feel good to them today or over the weekend, and then repeat back to them what you're hearing them say, that they weren't comfortable or they were scared or they were really sad. And just repeat their words and notice what the effect it has on you, and ask them what it feels like for them, for you just to repeat their words. Somebody writes here, what's the difference between giving empathy and giving a pass on actions? Sometimes it feels like the latter. Well, that has to do with boundaries. If you don't have boundaries, then you're going to be confused by this for sure. So if my boundary is that if you borrow my car, you have to return it with a full tank of gas, like the rental company. Let's say it had a full tank of gas. So you have to return it with a full tank of gas. And I lend it to you because your car broke down. You really need to get to this job interview today. And because you're my friend, I want you to succeed. So I lend you the keys to my car, and you bring it back and it's a quarter of a tank low on gas. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. It was really stressful. I was late and I've got to get home and feed my dog and blah, blah, blah. So that might bring up some anger in me or some confusion because you said you were going to do something and you didn't do it. And so I can have empathy for how busy you are and how upside down your life is and stressed out you are. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to ask you for the gas money or ask you to fill up my tank. And if I do that, then I'm a doormat. And I understand if it happens one time. I'm not super rigid. If it happened and my friend said, oh, here's $20, I'm so sorry, I'd be like, okay. But if it was something that happened repeatedly, then that's on me. So it's not about that person, it's that I don't have good boundaries. And then somebody says, can you share more about self-empathy and how to grow in this? Well, I think if you look at that self-compassion workbook, that is your best bet, whoever's asking that question. And also watch yourself during the day. Do you call yourself derogatory names when you drop something? Do you say, I'm an idiot, or that was stupid, or I can't believe what a jerk I was, or I'm so mad at myself for that. So pay attention to the internal messages you have going on, those internal tapes, if you will, and start to stop them. Just don't give them space in your head, and counteract them with a positive statement. Like, I'm not an idiot, I just didn't see that, so it fell. Or I'm not perfect, or I'm good enough. Start to counter those negative voices with positive affirmation statements. And then when you can, just don't let them have any landing space at all. And work with that self-compassion workbook. All right. Well, thank you all for your participation on this beautiful November 6th day. It's just incredibly gorgeous here in Southern California. I hope you're experiencing beauty in whatever place you are in the country. I also hope that you can practice empathy for what's happening on the global stage. There's so much pain right now, so much pain. And if we can just have empathy for our human experience, for our imperfection, I think holding a consciousness of empathy and kindness assists with the equal and opposite value of violence that's taking place today. So take good care of yourselves, be well, and enjoy practicing empathy. And I'll see you next month. Oh, and happy Thanksgiving.